शीतला सस्य श्यामला मातरम् वन्दे मातरम् शुभ्रज्योत्स्ना पुलकितयामिनी पुल्लकुसुमित द्रुमदल शोभिनी सुभासिनी सुमधुर भाषिणी सुखदां वरदां मातरम् वन्दे मातरम् वन्दे मातरम्.
Thank you. अपना स्थान अभी स्थान करते हैं हम लोग से चेंज कर क्योंकि अब टाइम बाकी दिखा टाइम कम है अभी. Thank you. अब आप I will now introduce the guest speaker. Dr. Prasenjit Basu is the author of Asia Reborn. A continent rises from the ravages of colonialism and war to a new dynamism. LF New Delhi 2017. And a co-author of the India as a new global leader. Foreign Policy Center, London 2005. Asia Reborn is the first chronicle of the modern economic and political history of the whole of Asia, told from Indic Hindu perspective. He was chief economist, Southeast Asia and India, at Credit Suisse First Boston for 5 years, chief Asia economist for Diverse Securities for 5 years, and had a short stint as chief economist at Khazana National Malaysia, chief ASEAN economist at Macquarie Securities, global research head at the Maybank Group, chief ASEAN economist at UBS, and a director of the Asia Service at Walton Economics, Philadelphia. He is currently an adjunct professor at ESSEC Business School, Singapore, and has previously taught at University of Pennsylvania and the SP Jain School of Global Management in Singapore and Dubai. Dr. P.K. Basu has written a comment article at the Financial Times, New York Times, India Today, Asian Age, Business Times, New Straits Times, The Statesman and Swarajya, and regularly provides expert commentary on Asia's economics and politics on the BBC, CNBC Asia, Channel News Asia, G Business, etc. He has dual master degree in public administration and international relations from University of Pennsylvania and B honors in economics from St. Stephen College, Delhi. He is president of the Singapore India Club and Tagore Society. Let us welcome and give a warm welcome to Dr. Basu. He is going to give a talk on Sanatan Dharma and Southeast Asia.
Thank you very much. I particularly would like to thank Shri and Sarafji for inviting me today. It's very inspiring to have Vande Mataram start the proceedings. This is, of course, completely what should happen at every occasion when Indians meet. But for many decades, it was controversial even to sing Vande Mataram. But today I'll be talking about the influence of the Sanatan Dharma on Southeast Asia. I prefer to use Sanatan Dharma rather than Hinduism, because the very word Hindu is actually a Farsi word. It's a Persian word to refer to the people who live beyond the Sindhu river. And in Persian, right from the ancient version of Persian, Sir is pronounced Her, like it is in Assamese. And so they say Sindhu, but the Persians pronounce Sindhu as Hindu, and that's how we came to be called Hindus. So the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, perhaps ideally we should call it Vishwa Sanatan Dharma Parishad. But anyway, we have a long history of being under foreign dominion. So for about 500 or 600 years, the official language of India was in fact Farsi. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, when he wrote his first 3 books, they were written in Farsi. He, in fact, was essentially the founder of what is called the Renaissance of Bengal and India. But the Renaissance man was educated in a madrasa and started off as an expert in Persian. In first 3 of his books were written in Persian. Later he taught himself Bengali and Hindi and Sanskrit, and then he started writing books in Indian languages. And if you think about Sri Aurobindo, it's a very interesting story. Sri Aurobindo, another great Sanatani, when Sri Aurobindo when he was brought up in a family where his father wanted to be so English that he didn't want to let his children, his 3 eldest children, learn any other language apart from English. So it is somewhat tragic that we speak to each other in the linked language of English. But of course, Sri Aurobindo was sent off to school in a prominent school in London, the best school in England, in fact, even today, St. Paul's School, London. At Cambridge, he studied the classics tripos. He studied basically Latin and Greek, and he did brilliantly. He got a first class first in the classics tripos at Cambridge. He knew English, he knew Latin, he knew Greek, but he knew not a single word of any Indian language until he decided not to appear for the writing test for the Indian Civil Service exam. He topped the written test, but decided not to appear for the writing test. He came to India, joined the service of the Maharaja of Baroda, the Gaikwads of Baroda, and that's when he first taught himself Sanskrit. He taught himself Hindi and Bangla, and then of course he became a true savant of Indian culture and a true guru of our Sanatan Dharma. So it is somewhat tragic, I think, that we have to speak in English. I wish I could speak to you in Sanskrit, but we were hardly taught Sanskrit in our schools during the era of Nehruvian pseudo-English rule of India. And it is time that we have more of an opportunity to ensure that the next generation learns not only English, but also the ancient linked language of India, which is of course Sanskrit. And Sanskrit was alive and well in Southeast Asia when it almost died in India itself. The very word for this land that you live in was Siam, until it was renamed Thailand in the late 1930s. Siam is a word that comes from Sanskrit. It comes from Shama. Sham, which basically means brown, is the name of this land. And not only is it the name of this land, here you have Ram Rajya. The last 10 kings of this land are all called Ram. You have Rama 3 road, you have Rama 6 road, you have Rama 9, now you have Rama 10. And of course, the capital of the land before it was ruled by the Chakri dynasty, the capital was Ayodhya. Pronounced Ayutthaya here, but Ayodhya was the capital. And Ayodhya, the Ayutthaya of Siam, was a city that was more resplendent than the Paris and London of its time. So it gives me enormous pleasure and it is a great honor to be here in this land where Ram still rules. To think about the Sanatan Dharma here, you go to any Wat, you go to any of the temples, you have Ramakian all over the walls. Vishnu, Shiv and Brahma are worshipped and given just as much importance here as they are in India. Perhaps more respect here than they are in India. There was the Erawan shrine where you had a terrorist incident a few years ago. It is a shrine, of course, to Brahma, as we all know. So the influence of the Sanatan Dharma here is profound. It is visible and it is invisible. Everywhere you look, the Sanatan Dharma is alive and well in this land. If you look a little bit further in Cambodia, the kings of Cambodia are called Norodom. Norodom Sihanouk and now Norodom Sihamoni. Norodom is actually Narottam. Narottam, if you go to Bengal and Orissa, Narottam becomes Narottam. And then you go further east, it becomes Norodom. So, if you go to the great palace of the National Palace in Phnom Penh, it is a great celebration of the Ramayana. Just as the Wats and all the great Wat that you have here in Thailand have the Ramakian, so do the walls of the National Palace of Cambodia. And of course in Cambodia, you also had great kings, the Jayavarman and the other great kings that built the great Wat, the Angkor Wat, the national symbol of Cambodia. But in Cambodia, at the Angkor Wat, you find Vishnu, Shiv, Brahma, and the Buddha finding a place of equal importance. The walls of the Angkor Wat are full of the Ramayana and Mahabharata. They are as much a part of the living soul of Cambodia as anything else. And because of the period of colonial rule in this part of the world, there is this artificial division between Buddhism and Hinduism. Buddhism is a branch of the Sanatan Dharma. Just as we worship the Buddha and accord great respect to him, so do Buddhists accord respect to the whole pantheon of what constitutes the Sanatan Dharma. We see this, of course, not only in Siam and Cambodia, we see it in Indonesia. Indonesia, historically, from about the 2nd century AD, Indonesia was ruled by various dynasties that had their roots in the Sanatan Dharma. So, in what is now called Sumatra, but then was known as Suvarnadweep, they ruled the great dynasty of the Sri Vijaya Empire, and in Java they ruled a great empire called Mataram. Mataram was purely Hindu empire. Sri Vijaya was Mahayana Buddhist mainly, but they were empires of the Sanatan Dharma. And it is not entirely clear how the Sanatan Dharma reached those parts of the world. There are lots of theories about it. Perhaps there was a lot of trade between India and the East Indies or Indonesia. Perhaps there was a lot of movement one way or the other. But the real reason why the Sanatan Dharma has a place of such importance in these parts is simply that if you look at the history of the world, through most of world history until 300 years ago, India was the world's largest economy. And I am not saying this because I'm some sort of atavistic person who believes only in the Vedas. I am saying this on the basis of the most prominent economic historian globally, Angus Maddison. Angus Maddison's work shows that in the year of Christ's birth, 0 AD or 0 BCE, in that year, India's GDP accounted for 32.9% of world GDP. In the year 1000, 1,000 years later, India's GDP accounted for 28.4% of world GDP. In the year 1700, India accounted for 24.4% of world GDP. So, right through that period, throughout recorded history for which there is any record, the first 1700 years of recorded history, India was the world's largest economy. India was finally overtaken by China as the world's largest economy only in 1820. In 1820, China finally, for the first time in the history of humanity, China became the world's largest economy and India fell to second place. India fell to second place partly because when the British began to trade with India, even before the British had conquered India, when they began to trade with India, they first used to buy textiles from India. Almost all the world's textiles used to be manufactured in India. Most of the world's ships were made in either India or what is now Indonesia, in Makassar, in Indonesia. So most of the world's shipbuilding is happening here. India had steel. You know, if you look at the great iron pillar of Delhi, the iron pillar of Delhi is made of stainless steel. It hasn't stained, it's still there, it's not rusted after being in existence for more than 1,000 years. So there is evidence that India had steel long before anybody else did. So there was obviously technological advances being made in India that nobody else was making. The next place where steel exists is in Damascus. That is after Mahmud of Ghazni and others came to destroy things, but they also carried away some of India's rich scientific and technological knowledge, and then you find steel in Damascus. Damascus steel is quite well known to the West. Indian steel, the only evidence we have is the great iron pillar of Delhi next to the Qutub Minar, which of course used to be a great temple of the Sanatan Dharma as well. And then of course, around the same time, you had the great destruction of Nalanda, but I'll come to that in a moment. If you look further east, go further east to Japan. And Japan, among other things, until 1888, the people of Japan did not eat beef. Beef eating was prohibited to the Japanese until 1888. For us, it is a bit shocking to even think of this. In 1988, when Japan had a trade dispute with the United States, one of the things that the Americans wanted to sell to the Japanese was beef. And the Japanese said, no, no, Japanese intestines can only digest Kobe beef. So in 100 years, Japanese intestines had evolved so much that they could only digest beef made in Japan. But anyway, until 1888, 20 years after the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese did not eat beef. They in fact revered the cow. They also didn't, they had very limited amount of use of dairy products as well. The reverence for the cow was deep. But in modernizing themselves, they said we have to copy the things that make the Western people successful. And one of the odd things that they decided to do was to start eating beef, to become tall and big. I think they did not entirely succeed, but that is what they decided. But the point is, historically, the link is there. And not only there, if you think about the religion of Japan, the primary religion, of course, is Shinto. And Shinto has many similarities to the Sanatan Dharma. They have goddesses. Avalotikeshwara is, of course, one of the bodhisattvas who's given a great deal of reverence in Japan. But the concept of Zen Buddhism, the word Zen comes from Dhyan. Dhyan, when it reached China, the word Dhyan became Chan. And when the word Chan reached Japan, it became Zen. So there is a deep link between us and the Japanese. If you go to any temple in Japan, if you go to the Kiyomizu temple in Kyoto, or any of the great temples of Japan, there is a fundamental spiritual unity that you feel with the Sanatan Dharma. And of course in Vietnam, until about 600 or 700 years ago, the Vietnamese were fully ruled by the great kingdom of Champa. Champa, or now known only to them as the Cham, who now live primarily in the hills. The Chams still exist. Many of them are now Muslims, but a very few are still adherents of the Sanatan Dharma. But for centuries, the Champa kingdom was deeply imbued with the Sanatan Dharma and was the ruling regime there. And of course, China, if you think about the way the Chinese worship, they use the vibhuti, they have gods and goddesses that are almost exact replicas with different names as we do. There is an equivalent for Lakshmi, there is an equivalent for Saraswati, there is an equivalent for Durga, there is an equivalent for any god you think of in China. There's also a monkey god in many parts of China. There's a monkey god. There is, of course, the journey to the west of Huan Sang, and Huan Sang came to Nalanda. He came to Nalanda to study Buddhism, and it was normal. Nalanda, from about the 5th to the 12th century AD or BCE, Nalanda was the Oxford and Cambridge of the world combined. Oxford and Cambridge did not exist then, of course. The British were in the jungles at that time. But Nalanda was a huge university that was devoted to all the branches of the Sanatan Dharma. It was devoted to all sorts of knowledge, some of what you will think of as spiritual knowledge, some of what you will think of as secular knowledge, but all branches of knowledge were studied, and people from all over the world came to study in Nalanda, just as people now go to Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, and the University of Pennsylvania to study. And of course, in 1193, Nalanda was burnt down by a marauder called Bakhtiyar Khilji. And it is said that Nalanda burnt for 3 to 4 months because there were so many millions of books that they just burnt and burnt for over 3 months. There were buildings in Nalanda that were 10 to 12 stories in height. There were several million books, of course. It was one of the greatest libraries, one of the greatest universities in history. And people from all over Southeast Asia and all over Asia, including China and Japan and Korea, came there to study. So that is the eastern side. Actually, if you look to the west as well, I talked about Iran. It is quite interesting that in Iran, the ancient religion of Iran is called Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism has many similarities to the Sanatan Dharma as well, including worship of fire, of course, and great respect for fire, which also extends to Judaism in what is today Israel. But the language, the ancient language of Persia, was very similar to Sanskrit, and only a few differences. One difference was that they pronounced "sir" with a "her." So the main god of the Persians was called Ahura Mazda. Ahura, if you think about it, is actually Asura. So in the mythology of ancient Persia, the gods are the Asuras and the Asuras are the Devas. I mean, obviously at some point, maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, the followers of the Devas came to what is now India, and the followers of the Asuras went to Iran, what is now Iran, Persia. And so if you think about our mythology going back, then Indra has many good sides, but he also has some bad sides. So if you think about the Asuras and the Devas, they are somewhat human. Both the Devas and the Asuras have certain human elements, and they are, but if you think about the ancient civilization of India included what is today Iran and ancient Persia. It also went all the way to Iraq. In Iraq, the ancient people of Iraq today follow the religion that's called Yazidi. The Yazidis have a religion that is very akin to the Sanatan Dharma. Their temple spires look like temples of the Sanatan Dharma. They look like temples of what we call Hindus and Buddhists, similar temples with spires like this. And they also worship peacocks. Mayur. There are no peacocks in the harsh climate of Iraq. And the Yazidis have been in Iraq for at least 3,000 years. So sometime about 3,000 years ago, they must have gone to Iraq from India. Or they may have just been part of the same civilization. And so the fact that ancient India was the world's largest economy, the world's largest trader for most of history. India traded with everybody because it was the largest economy. Everybody wanted to sell into it. So if you think about ancient Mesopotamia, which is called Iraq today, the people, Babylon and Mesopotamia, there are lots of artifacts from the Indus Valley civilization that exist there, and artifacts from Mesopotamia that exist in the Indus Valley civilization. So we had these ancient links that brought the whole region together. And similarly, in Sri Lanka, now we think again, this artificial barrier between Hinduism and Buddhism is completely artificial, and the strongest evidence of that is in Sri Lanka. The last king, see the Sri Lankans, what is now Sri Lanka, earlier called Ceylon. Ceylon was ruled by the Portuguese for 150 years, by the Dutch for 150 years, and then by the British for 150 years. So it had 450 years of European conquest. But the last of the kingdoms, the only kingdom in Sri Lanka that did not ever surrender to the Portuguese and the Dutch, was the kingdom of Kandy, with its capital in Anuradhapura. In Anuradhapura there is the great temple with the Buddha's tooth. There is of course a story of how the son of the Buddha, the son of Ashok, Mahendra, went to Sri Lanka and converted the people of Sri Lanka to Buddhism. But the interesting story is that Anuradhapura, the capital of Kandy, was ruled by Telugu kings. At least the last 5 kings of Anuradhapura or Kandy were Telugus, Telugu-speaking kings who were imported to Sri Lanka generation after generation from the great Vijayanagar kingdom of South India. And Vijayanagar was the last great kingdom of the Sanatan Dharma in India. Indian history is written from a Delhi perspective, so we only think of Prithviraj Chauhan as the last Sanatani ruler of India. He was only the ruler of a small principality around Delhi. Vijayanagar was a far greater empire, and Vijayanagar, by the time Babur arrived in Delhi, Vijayanagar was the great kingdom that Babur was in awe of. And European travelers who came to Vijayanagar found that its capital, now called Hampi, was a much greater city than all the cities of Christendom. Paris and London were tiny compared to Hampi. But after the fall of Vijayanagar, the Sanatan Dharma survived in the kingdom of Kandy in Sri Lanka. And if you look at the flag of Sri Lanka today, it is actually the flag of Kandy. The kingdom of Anuradhapura, which was the Sanatani kingdom, it finally fell to the British in 1815. And you may have heard the name Sirimao Bandaranaike. Sirimao Bandaranaike was Prime Minister of Sri Lanka for many years, and her daughter then became Prime Minister and President of Sri Lanka. Sirima Bandaranaike was the descendant of one of the Nayak noblemen of the ancient kingdom of Kandy in Anuradhapura. So there is this deep link wherever you go across Southeast Asia and South Asia. There is the deep link between us and them. We all should think of ourselves as part of one great family, the Sanatani family, that links us all. So that is the first half of what I wanted to say today. But today is also 18th August, 73 years ago today, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose left Saigon. He'd actually, on the 17th of August, he was here in Bangkok. He flew from Bangkok to Saigon, and what happened to him thereafter is unknown. But I would like to today talk a little bit about how this region played a vital role in bringing freedom to India. This is a story that has been covered up in the mythology of the Congress Party in India. But the real story of how India got its independence starts partly here in Bangkok. There was a man called Gyani Pritam Singh. Gyani Pritam Singh was the founder of the India Independence League in Thailand. He was a veteran of the Gadar Rebellion during the First World War. We don't know anything about the Gadar Rebellion. Very few people remember what the Gadar Rebellion was about. But I can assure you that to the British, Gandhiji was never someone that they feared very much. They feared him for 1 or 2 years, 1921 and 1922. He really had them on the run. But the people that they feared most of all were the revolutionaries of India. The revolutionaries of India started in 1857. Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, Tatya Tope, Nana Sahib, the son of the last Peshwa of the Marathas. There were some other great fighters. I would say that Mirza Mughal, the original crown prince in Delhi, also was potentially a great leader. And Bakht Khan, the leader of the Sipahis, and many others. 1857 is a story that needs to be told properly, and hopefully my book begins to tell the story, but other historians need to look at it, and I think they will. So 1857, of course, after a year or two, was ultimately defeated, mainly through the use of Indian troops. The troops from the Punjab, Sanatanis from Nepal played a big part. Sadly, Sanatan Kingdom of Nepal was the leading ally of the British in 1857-58. And Nepal exists as a separate country mainly because of the help that they gave to Britain in 1857. But during the period from about 1905, when the British, see, first of all, in 1905, we had the great episode where the Japanese defeated the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. The first time since the Mongols, really, that an Asian power had defeated a European power. You know, Genghis Khan, we think of Genghis Khan as a fearsome person. But Genghis Khan, firstly, was a Sanatani. please be aware that he was, even though he has a name called Khan, he was a believer in shamanism, which is a form of Sanatan Dharma, and he was a believer in, and then his grandson Kublai was a Buddhist, and the capital of China under Kublai Khan was called Khanbalik. Khan is actually a Mongol name, and the Mongols even today are Sanatani Buddhists. So if you think about Genghis Khan, his sons, one of his sons, Hulegu, conquered the whole of what is today Russia and Ukraine and all of what is today Eastern Europe. He reached the gates of Vienna, but then he stopped there because Genghis Khan had died in Mongolia, and he came back. And had he gone further, perhaps the whole world would be Sanatani. Genghis Khan was perhaps the greatest Sanatani conqueror in history. But he stopped, and Hulegu came back. And one of the grandsons of Genghis Khan became the ruler of China as Kublai Khan. Another became the ruler of Persia and Iraq, both Iran and Iraq. And somehow, after 2 or 3 generations, the Mongols of Persia and Iraq converted to Islam. Just as many people in in Indonesia, what is today Indonesia, converted to Islam. Now the story of that is quite interesting. It was a voluntary conversion. The initial conversions, Parameshwara, the king of Malacca, converted to Islam in 1409. And the kingdom of Mataram, which basically was the great Sanatani kingdom of Java, finally converted to Islam around 1527, around the year of the first Battle of Panipat in India. Around the same time, you had a conversion here as well. But what is interesting is that the Mataram kingdom still rules Yogyakarta. Yogyakarta in Indonesia, in East Java today, is still ruled by the descendants of Mataram. And they have maintained many of the traditions of the Sanatan Dharma, even without knowing it. They certainly have a great deal of regard for what they think of as the national mythology of Java, which is based on the Mahabharata and Ramayana. In fact, if you go back, perhaps the greatest Mataram king was called Airlanga. Airlanga was actually Balinese. He was a Balinese prince who married a princess of Mataram. And the most prominent modern epic of Indonesia is called the Arjuna Vivaha. Arjuna Vivaha is the story of Airlanga's wedding to the princess of Mataram. And Airlanga's successor in Mataram was called Karta Negara. Negara, Nagar, yeah, we think of Nagar, but Nagar in the Malay language is nation. So Bank Negara is national bank. So Karta Negara is the Karta of the nation. So national Karta, Karta Negara was perhaps either Airlanga or Karta Negara was the greatest king of Indonesian history. You think of the entire history, and they think back, the 2 greatest kings were Airlanga and Karta Negara. And Karta Negara had a prime minister called Gajah Mada. Gajah is elephant, Gajah. Gajah Mada was the prime minister of the greatest ruler of Indonesian history. So the deeper you look into this part of the world, the closer the links are, and it is up to us to maintain those links and to ensure that those historic ties stay alive and are kept alive. Those links are kept alive in a much more real way than they have been during the first half century of so-called independent India under the last Englishman to rule India, Jawaharlal. So coming back to the story of the First World War. During the First World War, on the 20th of August 1917, the British Secretary of State for India, Lord Montagu, promised in the House of Commons that that Britain would grant self-determination to the people of India after the war. This was a promise made. But ironically, after the war ended, what India got was something called the Rowlatt Act. In March 1919, Britain promulgated the Rowlatt Act, which is basically what Indira Gandhi did in 1975 with the emergency. The right to arrest without warrant, without any basis at all. They had the right, they took upon themselves the right to arrest any Indian merely on the suspicion of being a revolutionary. And the reason they did that, the reason they went back completely on the idea of giving India self-determination and instead went to the other extreme, was because of the fear of what the revolutionaries might have done. And the revolutionaries were led by people like Lala Hardayal, who was a lecturer in Sanskrit and Indology at Stanford University. Lala Hardayal. We should remember and fate people like him. We should remember people like Bhaga Jyotin. So, Bhaga Jyotin Mukherjee was another of the great revolutionaries who was building the Gadar Rebellion. The Gadar Rebellion had the potential to be like 1857 because they had spoken to all the Sipahis, all the way from Peshawar to Sonargaon in East Bengal, Chittagong in Calcutta, Rangoon, Yangon today, Bangkok and Singapore. All over, wherever there were British troops, they were going to rise up on the 15th of February 1915. Unfortunately, there was a Gaddar. Like in all these situations, there's always an Indian Gaddar who, his name was Kripal Singh, by the way. Kripal Singh gave the game away. He reported to the British and the rebellion was put down. Except in Singapore. There was in fact a rebellion in Singapore. 800 troops rose in rebellion in Singapore on the 15th of February 1915. And the British had to call in troops from Japan. Japan was fighting on the side of the British in the First World War. The Japanese helped to put down the rebellion in Singapore. It took 9 days for the rebellion to be put down. 47 Britishers lost their lives during that rebellion. So 47 Indians were lined up in a place called Outram Road in Singapore. 47 of the rebels were lined up and shot in public with 3,000 people watching. In modern times, the Taliban does things like this. You have a stadium full of people watching and people are killed. But the British barbarians did it in 1915 to the Indian rebels. And the other 500 who were alive were sent off to exile in Africa. So this was the amount of fear that they had put into the British. And one of the leaders of the Gadar rebellion was called Gyani Pritam Singh. He escaped from India and came to live in Bangkok, where he established the Indian Independence League. And I'll come to the importance of this in a minute. Another of the leaders of the Gadar rebellion was called Ajit Singh, who was the chacha of Shahid Bhagat Singh. Shahid Bhagat Singh was inspired by his uncle Ajit Singh, also of the Gadar rebellion in the 1920s. And of course, the story of Shahid Bhagat Singh is well known, why he is a Shahid. But Gyani Pritam Singh came here. And then, during the Second World War, of course, early in the war, there was something called the Franco-Thai War. Most people don't know, even in Thailand, that the Thais defeated the French in the Franco-Thai War in January 1941. January 1941. And Thailand regained most of what they had lost to the French in what is now Western Cambodia. Battambang province in Cambodia was retaken by the Thais in the Franco-Thai War, and so was Laos taken back from the French by the Thais. Anyway, that was the beginning of the war. But thereafter, of course, Japan liberated most of Asia east of India from European rule between the 8th of December 1941 and early May 1942. The whole of Asia east of India fell to the Japanese. And when that happened, one of the last ones to fall was, of course, Burma. Before Burma fell, on the 15th of February, again, the same day, 15th of February 1942, Singapore fell to the Japanese. Or, in my view, Singapore was liberated from British rule by the Japanese. And there were 45,000 Indian prisoners of war taken in Singapore. Now, the interesting thing is that the Japanese had introduced Sanskrit and Kavi, two languages, into the University of Tokyo in 1900. So there was a whole generation of people in Japan who knew Sanskrit and who knew Kavi. Kavi is the language on which Javanese is based. So Javanese is to Kavi what Hindi is to Sanskrit. And so when they arrived in Java, they first released Sukarno from jail. By the way, Sukarno, the name Sukarno, is a Sanatani name. It actually is Karna. Su-Karn. Karn, of course, is another ambivalent figure from the Mahabharata. If you think about Karn, he is the half-brother of the Pandavas, but he supported the Kauravas, and therefore we're not very sure whether he should be a hero or a villain. So you can't name somebody Karn. You can name him Su-Karn. He's good Karn. So Sukarno is named after Karn from the Mahabharata. He's Su-Karn. And Sukarno, of course, in Javanese and Balinese, they're influenced by Bengal and Orissa, and so everything is O. Everything ends with O. Korno is the way we say it in Bengali. Shukorno, I would have said. Anyway, Shukorno becomes Sukarno in Indonesia. So the same sort of story. Now, so the first thing that the Japanese did when they conquered the East Indies is that they relieved Sukarno from jail. He had been in continuous detention under the Dutch for 10 continuous years, and for 13 of the previous 15 years he had been in jail. But for 10 continuous years, until the day of the liberation of Indonesia by the Japanese, Sukarno was in jail. He was released from jail by the Japanese and told, please create a national movement. And they introduced the study of Bahasa Indonesia into the schools. All schools used to be taught in Dutch, in the Dutch language. Until that day, they introduced Bahasa Indonesia. They introduced Tagalog in the Philippines. So the Sanatanis of Japan basically liberated Asia. Thank goodness. So if there were any Japanese in the room, I would say arigato gozaimashita. Anyway, because we need to thank them. But then what happened is that on the 15th of February 1942, after the liberation of Singapore, Colonel Fujiwara came to address the Indian troops, the Indian prisoners of war, 45,000 of them, at a place called Farrer Park, which still exists in Little India, in Singapore. And he started by saying, Bharat Mata Ki! This is how he started. And then of course he spoke mainly in Japanese, but he started with Bharat Mata Ki Jai. And the whole, he literally just said Bharat Mata Ki! And the crowd went crazy. So, from almost all the troops signed up, well, at least on the first day, 340 of them signed up immediately to join the Azad Hind Fauj. But after Fujiwara had spoken, two people spoke next. Both were veterans of the Gadar rebellion. One was Raj Bihari Bose and the other was Gyani Pritam Singh. Raj Bihari Bose was not only a hero of the Gadar rebellion, but in 1908, when there was a bomb factory found in the home of Sri Aurobindo. Remember I told you, Sri Aurobindo was the man whose father had taught him to speak only English and any Western language, but not any Indian language. But Sri Aurobindo and his brother Barindra Ghosh became revolutionaries. And in their house in Manikpala was a bomb factory. And the bomb factory was discovered, the Alipur bomb conspiracy. One of the 8 conspirators was Raj Bihari Bose. But he was the elusive Scarlet Pimpernel of India. The British could never capture him. So he escaped from there. He was never found. He was working in the Forest Research Institute in Dehradun, and he was never found. Then in 1912, when the capital of India was moved to Delhi, Hardinge, the Viceroy of India, was traveling on a great elephant triumphantly into the Red Fort, Lal Killa. As he entered Chandni Chowk, a bomb was thrown at him. And unfortunately, the bomb killed only the Mahood, not Hardinge. But that bomb was thrown by, most likely, Raj Bihari Bose. After that, they were looking for him again. They couldn't find him. He ended up in Japan. And in Japan, Raj Bihari Bose met the leaders of the Asian nationalist movements. He married a local. And if you go to Shizuoka today, there is still a restaurant called the Nakamuraya restaurant, started by Raj Bihari Bose, which still gives you the best curries. He taught them how to make curry. The first introduction of Japan to curries was by Raj Bihari Bose. Anyway, so the Nakamuraya restaurant still exists. I've eaten it. It's good, excellent. Well, slightly different from Indian food, but still almost authentic, you could say. Much more authentic than the Japanese curries, by the way. The Japanese. Now, Raj Bihari Bose and Gyani Pritam Singh. Gyani Pritam Singh of Bangkok, Raj Bihari Bose from Japan, addressed the crowd and recruited a lot of them. But that first INA fell apart. Then of course, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose escaped from imprisonment in Calcutta on the 16th of January 1941. He traveled to Peshawar, to Kabul, to Russia first, hoping to get support from Stalin, but Stalin was not very helpful, so he then went to Germany, met Hitler, Hitler also wasn't that helpful, but Hitler said, okay, I'll give you a submarine. And he took a submarine right through to Madagascar, shifted from a German submarine to a Japanese submarine off the coast of Madagascar, and arrived in Sumatra, or what we think of historically as Suvarnadvipa. He came to Suvarnadvipa, and then, of course, he took charge of the INA and formed the Azad Hind Fauj and the Arzi Hukumat-e-Azad Hind on the 21st of October 1943. And here we have, now, the story of India is that, first of all, the INA, the Azad Hind Fauj, liberated all of what is now the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. They were renamed the Swaraj and Shahid Islands. The flag of India was planted in Manipur and Nagaland.
We will love to hear all the time. We are
okay, 5 more minutes. I'll give you
I'm worried about your flight.
Yes. Okay, so I'll do quickly. So, Manipur and Nagaland, I'm just warming up now. But anyway,
We'll hold your flight.
We would love to hear for an hour.
So then he went to Manipur and Nagaland, and then unfortunately, of course, at that time, 1944, the Japanese were losing the Pacific War. They were losing islands in the Pacific. And so, it was American air power that defeated the INA and Japan in Manipur and Nagaland. And of course, a famous battle occurred across the tennis court in Imphal. But at any rate, now the point is that they were defeated supposedly. But what is important to recognize is that although the INA in theory was defeated in war, they won the peace. Let me tell you the story. In October 1945, General Auchinleck, the Commander-in-Chief of the British Indian Army, asked the senior officers like Cariappa and others, what should we do with the INA? Most of them said, try the buggers. They deserve to be hung. Hang them all. This was the original opinion. So on the 5th of November 1945, the INA trials began at the Lal Killa. Netaji had said, Chalo Delhi. So Delhi pahunche, but in chains, of course. There was a trial of the INA senior generals. But what is interesting is that for the first time, during the next 2 or 3 weeks, the people of India, the newspapers in India were filled with the real story of the INA. The real story of the INA was that it was a self-financed government. The Arzi Hukumat, the provisional government of Free India, was a self-financing government. It had its own Azad Hind Bank. It had its own currency, which was fully backed by gold. So some of your ancestors paid taxes and contributions that enabled the Azad Hind Fauj to have a bank of its own and currency of its own. And it was the people of Southeast Asia, 2 to 3 million people of Indian origin in Southeast Asia, who created this Azad Hind government. And when the people of India began to hear about this, they realized that for the first time since 1857, a true national army had been created of men and women who had fought for India's freedom. And when the news began to come out, there was a national upsurge. We don't realize this, but during the Quit India movement of Gandhiji, during the Quit India movement, during the 5 months after the Quit India movement, from August to December 1942, 1 lakh of Indians was joining the British Indian Army to fight for the British in the war. That was what a complete failure the Quit India movement was. But the difference was that now, by the 21st of November 1945, there was an upsurge of nationalism across India. And the governor of Punjab wrote to Wavell, beseeching him, please stop the INA trials because we have lost Punjab. The next day, the governor of NWFP said, we are losing NWFP as well. If we lose the Punjab and NWFP, where are we going to get our troops? And so it was becoming evident that they were going to lose it all. Now the Congress party had been killed off by the Quit India movement and the crushing of it militarily by the British. So there was an election to the central legislature held in December 1945. And do you know who led the Congress party's campaign in December 1945? Not Jawaharlal, not Vallabhbhai Patel, not Mahatma Gandhi, but Sharad Bose, the elder brother of Subhash Bose. Sharad Bose was not even a politician. He was not even a member of Congress because he and his brother had been expelled from Congress in 1941. But Congress besieged Sharad Bose to lead the campaign because there was a national upsurge in favor of the INA. And of course, Congress won a resounding victory. And so on the 4th of January 1946, the INA trials ended. The three officers, Saigal, Shanawaz and Dhillon, were supposed to be hanged until death. They had committed high treason, supposedly. But do you know what happened? They were acquitted. They were first given a life sentence, but the life sentence was commuted by the Commander-in-Chief of the British Indian Army. Why? He wrote a letter to all the senior officers of the British Indian Army saying, I have now found that all the Indian officers have become nationalists. I asked them, what will happen if we hang these three officers? They said, there will be such an insurgency in this country that you will never be able to hold on. And so, given this, I had to commute even their life sentences. So he had basically acquitted them to try and prevent a rebellion of the British Indian Armed Forces. Now, historically, the British Indian Armed Forces, starting from the Opium War, to the Boxer Rebellion, to the First World War, the Second World War, everywhere that the British fought in Asia, it was the British Indian Army that was fighting. If you think about people like Montgomery, the only one who won a battle during the Second World War, the only British officer who actually won a battle outside Asia was in North Africa, in El Alamein. Bernie Montgomery was an officer of the Indian Army, British Indian Army. All his troops were Indians. You think about Gallipoli in the First World War. It's something called Anzac Day and all that. The Australians and New Zealanders celebrate. The majority of troops were Gurkhas and Sikhs. Minority were Australians and New Zealanders. So now they could no longer rely on the British Indian Army. Now what happened was, on the 15th of January 1946, the Royal Indian Air Force rose in mutiny. 5,200 officers and men and pilots of the Royal Indian Air Force mutinied. On the 8th of February, a mutiny began on the HMIS Talwar, the main signal ship of the Royal Indian Navy. By the 18th of February 1946, 78 out of 88 ships of the Royal Indian Navy had joined the mutiny. Every single port joined the mutiny. Karachi, Visakhapatnam, Bombay, Calcutta, every single port, Madras, all the ports of the Royal Indian Navy were in mutiny. 18th of February 1946 is the day the British Empire ended. Because on the 19th of February 1946, Attlee announced in the House of Commons that he was sending the cabinet mission to negotiate India's freedom. In May 1945, I show you in the book, in May 1945, the British Armed Forces chiefs wrote a white paper for the British government talking about what needed to be done to control India and the Indian Ocean until 1960. 1960. There was no notion of leaving India. It was not ahimsa that brought us our freedom. Himsa, revolution. And the Revolutionary Army started here. So thank you to the Thais. Why is this important? This is important because Nehru had no regard for the army. And as a result, we had perversion after perversion. In 1950, in October 1950, China attacked our neighbor, Tibet. Tibet includes Mansarovar and Kailash, the abode of Shiv. It is our eternal neighbor. In October 1950, China attacked Tibet, and Nehru heard about it immediately. He kept it a secret from even his cabinet. Vallabhbhai Patel finally discovered on the 7th of November 1950, 1 month after the invasion had begun, that the whole of Tibet had been taken over by China. Throughout history, the only rulers of China that ruled Tibet were the non-Chinese. The Mongol dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, and the Manchu. The Manchu are not Chinese. The last dynasty that ruled China were the Manchu. They were also Sanatanis, they were Buddhists. And only the Buddhist rulers had links to Tibet, obviously, because they are Sanatani. They had the links with Sanatani, and therefore they had that link. There was no link ever to the Ming dynasty, the Tang dynasty, the Han dynasty. You look back to any Chinese dynasty, there was no link to Tibet. And in Tibet in 1950, India had an ambassador and 3 consulates in 3 different cities of Tibet. China had 0 representatives. There was nobody from China there. So it was completely an invasion. El Salvador introduced a resolution in the United Nations condemning the invasion of Tibet. El Salvador. India and Britain killed off the resolution. Now, before I started writing my book, I admired Jawaharlal Nehru. Today, I think of him as the ultimate Gaddar, and I've only started the story. There is much more. There is much more to his Gaddari. The Gaddari, of course, continued 1950, and it ended in 1962. By the time 1962 happened, the British Indian Army was a shell of what it used to be. But you still had you still had the Indian Air Force. Why didn't he use the Indian Air Force to cut off the supply lines of the People's Liberation Army? It is a mystery to me. But also, he appointed Krishna Menon. Krishna Menon, Maulana Azad, the first education minister of India, wrote a book called India Wins Freedom in 1958, just before he died. In 1958, 4 years before 1962, the war, he writes about Krishna Menon that Gandhiji, Sardar and me could all see that this man was a fellow traveler of the communists, a man not to be trusted. And yet, Jawaharlal had some sort of fascination for him. And he says, we all like our admirers, but Jawaharlal likes his admirers a bit more than others. And this man is one of those. Gaddari, Krishna Menon. We have a Krishna, when Atal Bihari Vajpayee died, to my horror, it turned out that he lived on 6B Krishna Menon Marg. How can you have a Krishna Menon Marg? The man who brought us the disaster of 1962 has one of the biggest streets in Delhi named after him. It is like having a Benedict Arnold Road in the middle of Washington DC. How can a traitor be commemorated in the capital? And our Prime Minister, the previous president, by the way, President APJ Abdul Kalam, also lived on Krishna Menon Marg. I once went to visit him. He had a beautiful bungalow on Krishna Menon Marg. We have a Krishna Menon Marg to commemorate this man who brought us the disaster of 1962 purposefully. He did it. He destroyed the Indian Army by not giving any equipment. And this is the story. Now, if we forget these things, if we don't learn from our history, then we will be condemned to repeat it again and again. So I'm running out of time. There's many more things. That's another story from 1948 that I really should tell you. And that is one last thing. You know, the INA veterans, some of your ancestors who joined, you know, the INA had 60,000 men and women. So many of them, out of those 60,000, about 25,000 were ancestors of the people of Southeast Asia, civilian recruits. Out of the 60,000 men and women, 26,000 died in the war. So we owe them the ultimate, because we owe them a huge debt as a nation. But the interesting story is that the Indian Army of Jawaharlal Nehru, or the New Dominion of India, did not accept any of the INA veterans back into the Indian Army. Ironically, Jinnah had no such qualms. Jinnah accepted the INA veterans into the Pakistan Army, including two of the leading generals, Habibur Rahman and General Niazi, the two leading generals of the INA, became generals in the Pakistan Army. And one of them, unfortunately, Habibur Rahman, who was with Netaji on his supposed last flight, was a Pakistani hero of the first Kashmir War. In India, INA veterans were not given a pension. They were not accepted into the army. They were finally given a nominal pension in 1972. But during the war, the British used to take things from India and not pay. So there was a debt. There was a British war debt to India that totaled $5.3 billion in the money of that time. Today was probably $55 billion. Anyway, $5.3 billion was owed by Britain to India at the end of the Second World War. Britain owed only $4.4 billion to America. Only $4.4 billion. This was the so-called Lend-Lease loans. But they owed $5.3 billion to India. Do you know what happened to that money? This $5.3 billion, firstly, for 10 years, nothing was done. Kept going. Normally, if you have something in foreign currency, you keep it in treasury bills, or at least in British treasury gilts, earning 4% interest. The British did not even allow that. So a lot of it just got devalued over time. But in the end, about half of the money was used to pay the pensions of Britishers who had served in India during the British period. So Indian taxpayers were paying the pensions of British military officers and civilians who had worked in British India. And the so-called independent government of India did not pay any pensions to the veterans who had fought for our freedom in the Azad Hind Fauj. So this is the nature of the Gaddari of Jawaharlal Nehru. I've just started. Of course, some of you may have heard of the question I asked Rahul Gandhi.
Yes.
But it's a simple question about the economic performance.
Please repeat.
No. Okay, I'll give you the question. The question was, how is it that during the years that your family ruled India, India's per capita income was growing less than the world average, and yet in the years since your family relinquished the Prime Ministership of India, India's per capita income has grown substantially faster than the world average? He had no answer. The Nehru family will never have an answer because they were a disaster for India. And I pray that we are rid of them forever. Jai Hind, Jai Shri Ram.